So The Gun by Vicki Feaver is quite an interesting one in that it talks about the ways in which something that you may initially be against or may not want ultimately may be something that you become complicit in. It also talks about the idea of masculinity and femininity, and notably, the gun itself and what a gun represents to different people. So it's quite an interesting one to consider in that respect. So Fever's poems are often dark and sensual, and they're reworkings of myth and fairy tale, earning her work the label of domestic Gothic. So it's not just this poem, but a lot of her poems kind of fall into that bizarrely named category, domestic Gothic. She takes seemingly mundane objects and invests them with the symbolic meaning of fairy tale. As in fairy tale, a recurrent theme is the repression of the female and desire. Often in her works, this leads to violence. If we think about fairy tales that are potentially more traditional, think, I don't know, Snow White, Cinderella, and so on, it's always the repressed female who desires to be free and escape, whatever she's stuck in, and this may at times lead to violence. All of these elements can be traced in the gun, with the weapon becoming a brooding presence in the house, which rouses the reticent inhabitants to violence. And Fever herself said when she was giving some information about this poem, she said, I lived in Brixton in central London for 20 years and thought I sometimes heard gunshots. I never actually saw a gun. But now living in Lancashire, Scotland, right in the middle of the country, I see lots of guns. Almost all men seem to have a shotgun. And then my own husband got a shotgun and brought it into the house, and at first I felt very afraid of it. And then gradually my whole attitude changed, as I describe in this poem. And you can kind of understand that. So, for example, a number of us may be very pro-gun, a number of us may be very anti-gun. And when you've got a partner who wants the thing that you're actively against, at some point there's got to be a butting of heads, if it were, and then at some point someone's got to become complicit in it and allow it to be there. And in this case, it's their husband who brings in the gun. So the poem is as follows. The gun. Bringing a gun into a house changes it. You lay it on the kitchen table, stretched out like something dead itself, the grainy polished wood stock jutting over the edge, the long metal barrel casting a grey shadow on the green checked cloth. At first it's just practice, perforating tins, dangling on orange string from trees in the garden. Then a rabbit shot clean through the head. Soon the fridge fills with creatures that have run and flown. Your hands reek of gun oil and entrails. You trample fur and feathers. There's a spring in your step. Your eyes gleam like when sex was fresh. A gun brings a house alive. I join in the cooking, jointing and slicing, stirring and tasting, excited as if the king of death had arrived to feast, stalking out of winter's woods, his black mouth sprouting golden crocuses. So have a think about that poem. You may want to pause the video and have a little consideration about how some of the ideas that you've got from the context that I've kind of given you are replicated in this poem. So a quick summary of the poem is the speaker describes the impact of a gun that it's had on themselves and their relationship with their partner. It seems to associate hunting and violence with pleasure and desire, while also considering the ideas of masculinity and femininity. At the end of the poem, Fever introduces an element of fantasy, suggesting the transgressive impact this object has had, and that's to do with the King of Death walking around, and that's quite a pagan figure. So the idea that this King of Death is coming to a house that has allegedly been brought alive by the gun is quite the juxtaposition. In terms of key themes and ideas, we've obviously got the theme of power, the power the gun has over the household, the power the male has over the female, the power the female has in some respects over what goes on in the domestic sphere. So consider those ideas. Gender, again, as I say, masculinity versus femininity, and conflict. The conflict between the domestic and what the gun represents, the conflict, and then the conflict between the genders, and then also you've got the idea of violence throughout the poem, about the rabbit shot clean through the head, and so on. So it's a fair bit of conflict throughout the poem. So the first section of it then, so the gun. The title itself refers to the literal object that is being discussed within the poem. And the fact that it's the title of the poem, it gives it prominence, it shows the significant impact this weapon has had on the speaker, the partner, the house, the relationship, and so on. It also very clearly emphasises to the reader or listener that this poem is going to reference violence and hunting and conflict. You don't call something the gun and then write about a little rainbow adventure. It's going to be about something aggressive somewhere. Bringing a gun into a house changes it. So again, you've got that juxtaposition there between the gun and the connotations of that being violence and pain and death versus the connotations of house, which usually is associated with comfort and safety and security. The idea that the gun has compromised that is demonstrated in the enjambment that is present, so where the house and then it starts a new line, changes it. Already the gun has affected the house in some way to the point where a new line needs to be made. You lay it on the kitchen table, stretched out like something dead itself. It's depersonalizing the people. So you lay it on the kitchen table. Again, it's not husband, it's not a name, it's you lay it on the kitchen table, stretched out like something dead itself. It's quite a, how to word it, it's quite a worrying image. This is within a kitchen, the domestic, stereotypically feminine idea, and then it's being described as something dead. So you threw that simile, like something dead itself. Well, we know that the gun brings about death. The gun itself isn't death or dead. So again, you've got those kind of ideas to consider. The grainy, polished woodstock jutting over the edge, the long metal barrel casting a grey shadow on the green checked cloth. So you've got the idea of the long metal barrel over the edge. That is potentially a phallic image, so penis imagery, again associated with the masculine, and you can see it's transgressing. So the fact that it juts out over the edge, it's sort of a little bit over the edge of the kitchen table, so it's not quite fully in, if that makes sense. So it's sort of slowly starting to transgress. And then you've got the colour imagery there. So you've got this grey shadow, and grey is usually associated with growing darkness, or, you know, if something's a grey area, it's sort of not quite moral but not immoral. There's this loss of pure morality or loss of purity. And then you've got this on the green check cloth, and green is usually associated with nature and life and so on. So you've got this shadow upon life, you could argue. At first it's just practice, perforating tins, dangling on orange string from trees in the garden, then a rabbit shot clean through the head. So you've got the idea that it's at first, it's just practice, so you know this is going to develop and the violence is going to increase. So it's not just going to be tins and so on, and it's perforating tins, dangling, so he's, if you can imagine someone with a tin can and they're dangling off something and then they're practicing shooting it, so get their aim right. They're trying to practice as they're shooting essentially, so they can get the clean shot. And you've also got the plosiveness of the practice perforating tins. Again, I would argue the plosives there, those strong plosive sounds demonstrate maybe the bullets, maybe the aggression within the air. You know, this is quite a calm poem, and the next stanza's got some fricatives in it which demonstrate something different, but this one is quite aggressive maybe. And then you've got this very stark declarative, then a rabbit shot clean through the head. It's very blunt, it's very just to the point. This is a weapon that has the capability of killing, and that is what it's for, and that is what it's going to be used for. And again, it's not, if you notice in the stanza, it's not saying my husband goes out and practices shooting stuff and my husband goes out and practices shooting this rabbit. It's then a rabbit shot clean through the head. It's almost the removal of the human action. It's almost like the gun is doing it itself. Um, so you again may want to consider how that would relate to the idea of power within this poem. Soon the fridge fills with creatures that have run and flown. Your hands reek of gun oil and entrails. You trample fur and feathers. There's a spring in your step. Your eyes gleam like when sex was fresh. You see, you've got the fricative alliteration, so you've got fridge fills, and then you've got fur and feathers later on, and it kind of suggests this idea of excess. There's just so much. The fridge is filled with dead animals, essentially, so it kind of reinforces that sense of excess. Um, all the other little animals, bless them, now creatures that have run and flown, not just the rabbit from the stanza before, but birds and other animals that run that they wanted to shoot. They're now all within this fridge, dead because they've been shot by the gun. And then you've got the kind of description of smell here and sight, and just you can smell the gun oil on him, and the house is now covered in fur and feathers. It is it's invading the house. The effect of this gun, so it's now the house, and the husband particularly is smelling of the gun. He's bringing in some of the things that the gun has produced, the fur and the feathers, and there's a spring in his step, or there's a spring in your step. So again, he's excited by this. He is enjoying it. And then your eyes gleam like when sex was fresh. That similarly suggests that the gun is bringing them a youthfulness and a virility that potentially had waned as they've been married a while, but this gun is almost bringing back that excitement for them. And then the single declarative sentence, a gun brings a house alive. Okay, again, think of the juxtaposition and almost the oxymoronic way of thinking about that, the idea that how can a gun bring something alive? That doesn't seem to work, and yet in this case it does. It has brought this couple alive, because in the following stanza, I join in the cooking, jointing and slicing, stirring and tasting, excited as if the king of death had arrived to feast, stalking out of winter's woods, his black mouth sprouting golden crocuses. You've now got the idea that the female is complicit in the actions. The wife is now complicit. She is now cooking and jointing and slicing and so on. Note how she is doing the very stereotypical female roles within the relationship. She's the cook and he's the hunter-gatherer kind of thing. So they do seem to have this quite traditional gender-rolled relationship. Then you've got the King of Death had arrived to feast. Again, as I said at the beginning, that is a pagan figure. And it is interesting that while the couple have been almost brought alive by this gun, because they're now got so much food and so many things to eat and feast upon, the King of Death is visiting, which is quite an odd idea here. And that's where she starts bringing in this magical and fairy tale element with his existence, stalking out the winter woods. His black mouth sprouting golden crocuses. So if you imagine his mouth, it's black because he's the king of death, but out of his mouth, out of his death, becomes life, these golden flowers that exist. So, and again, think of flowers representing life and nature and all beauty and so on. So is this the idea that out of awful things, or but stereotypically awful things, goodness can come from them? Yeah, that's up to you. In terms of structural features, we've got the idea that the poem is irregular and uses a range of enjambment and caesura to create a sense of chaos and of conflict. There is quite an ominous tone established by the title and subject matter, and it is continued through the lack of consistency or clear rhythm. If you actually look through the poem, the stanzas are all different, there's enjambment throughout, etc. There's no specific rigidity to this poem. Punctuation also plays an important role. It helps to shape the rhythm and can be interpreted as creating the sounds of shooting and bullets, or alternatively, the abrupt changes in situations as a result of using guns. Again, if you look back through the poem and note where the punctuation is, potentially see if you think they could represent where bullets might be flying about. And finally, a notable example of enjambment is, as I said at the beginning, the first two lines where house and changes, and how that is an unnatural break, but that's deliberate because the gun has brought about that change. Now, the exam board have said about this poem, the poem's audacious relish of the physical acknowledges the thrill of connection between sex, death, and life. The opening stanza is dramatic, shocking even. A line, literal and metaphorical, has been crossed. The house is traditionally associated with life and family, a place where we feel safe. What enters into his sanctuary is a potential threat, a means of taking life. The atmosphere of violence is sustained throughout the poem, particularly through the sound of the language and the structure of the lines and stanzas. In the second stanza, for instance, short lines and disruptive line breaks combine with hard consonantal sounds to give an angular, edgy feel to the description of the gun. It's as if the gun's explosive potential is embedded in the sound the poem makes. Enjambment, the running on of units of sense over two or more lines, also has the effect of shining a small spotlight on those words at the end and start of a line. The gun is full of such examples, e.g. a rabbit shot, clean through the head, or your hands reek of gun oil and entrails, you trample fur and feathers. In this way, the line breaks enact the violent encounter between the human and animal worlds. The poem also breaks contemporary liberal taboos around hunting and valuing the natural world, as well as gender roles. The narrator is seen as complicit in the gun's use, but in a traditional female role, cooking what the man has brought her. By exploring the primitive thrill of hunting and its connection to our most basic instincts, Feaver prepares the ground for the extraordinary last stanza. At this point, we move into a world of ancient rites and pagan beliefs with the appearance of the King of Death. The poem's contention that death brings life more starkly into focus is beautifully expressed in the last image of the king's mouth sprouting golden crocuses. A quick example of a kind of model, wouldn't say a whole paragraph, but a section of a paragraph, is how does Feaver present violence in the gun? You could say, the theme of violence is introduced at the beginning of the poem, not only through the declarative title that establishes an ominous tone and sense of unease through the connotations of death and hunting, but the first stanza, bringing a gun into a house, changes it. The juxtaposition between house, which traditionally symbolises domesticity and security, and the titular gun heightens the sense of tension and shocking impact of the object. This is further demonstrated through the significant use of enjambment, which physically represents the change or unnatural break or transgression this event has had on the household and the speaker respectively. In terms of things you could be doing, obviously I've given the links there to support you in your analysis. And in terms of additional ideas, you may want to think about what the narrator means when she says a gun brings a house alive. What evidence does the poem present to support that idea that they're all more alive? Does the poem convince you that the gun has acted in that way? Number two, how do the links between natural and destructive imagery make the poem more effective? And number three, look closely at the line breaks in the poem. What do you notice about them, and how do you think they connect to the poem's subject matter?